Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be solving the 2018 CCC J2 question called Occupy Parking. Opening up the question, we can see that it says, we supervise a small parking lot which has n parking spaces. And yesterday and today we both record which parking spaces were occupied and which were empty. So our input specification says we're going to get an integer n, signifying the number of parking space we're responsible for, which is going to be between 1 and 100. And the second and third lines of input contain n characters each, and the second line of input records the information about yesterday's parking space, and the third line of input records today's parking space. Each of these characters will be either a C to indicate an occupied space or a dot to indicate that it was an empty parking space. So we can see in the sample input, we're in charge of 5 parking spaces, and out of these 5 parking spaces, yesterday, the first and second were occupied, the third and fourth were not occupied, the fifth was occupied, and we have a different sort of information for the today's information. The reason it's outputting 1 is because if you look at the information, there's only one parking spot which is occupied on both days. And this is the second parking spot right here. So on yesterday, the second parking spot was a C, and today it is also a C. Only the second parking spot was occupied on both days. So basically the way we're going to attempt this is by comparing the status of the same parking spaces on both days. What we want our program to do is look at the first parking spot of yesterday's information and see if it has the same value today. If it does, we're going to check whether this same value is a dot or the character C. Only if it is the character C will we acknowledge it, because the dot signifies that the parking space was not occupied and we don't need that information. So it's going to take our first character, and it's going to take the first character of yesterday and today. It's going to see whether or not they're the same. Well, here we can obviously they're not the same, so we're not going to acknowledge it. Let's say it moves on to the second. It's going to say, okay, well, this is a C here. This is also a C. They're both equal to each other, but are they both equal to C? In this case, yes, they are, so we acknowledge the fact. In the fourth parking space, for example, they both are dots, but because both of them are not equal to C, we're not going to acknowledge that fact, and we're just going to completely disregard that. And so how do we do this? Well, first we have to get the user input and store it. So the first step is to create an instance of the scanner class, which is what we're going to use to get our input, and we can call it S. So you can see I already have the scanner class imported right here, and all we're going to do is we're going to say scanner S is equal to new scanner system.in, and boom. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to create a line to write the input. So we can just say system.out.println, and now here's where we're going to get or store the values into, so we store the values into variables basically. So the first input we're going to get is the integer n, right, which is the number of parking spaces. And the reason we're not going to use the method s.nextInt, which is what is traditionally used, is because this only allows for one single line of code to be read. I want this one scanner class, or this one scanner object, to take in all 3 lines of input one after the other, instead of creating 3 different objects of the scanner class, each with its own input. The nextInt method doesn't allow that to happen because it only reads this one line of input. So the way we fix that is by using the method called nextLine. Now you see I get a compilation error because this is only accepting string values, and obviously we can't store that or assign that to an integer variable. So what we have to do now is parse this value into an integer, and this is done through the wrapper class. So I can just control X or cut this, and I can say integer, the wrapper class dot parse int, oops, this was right there, parse int s.nextLine, and boom, you see now it works because now it's just taking whatever this string value is, putting it into an integer, and assigning that to our variable n. And since we use the nextLine method right here, it's going to go down to the next line, and we're going to say string yesterday's info, which is our next piece of information or input, is equal to s.nextLine. So because it's already a string, it gets assigned immediately. We can do the same thing for today's info. So we're going to say today info equals s.nextLine. And now we have all 3 of our inputs stored into variables, and we can move on to the next step, which is data processing. So Now we're gonna compare each character of both yesterday's information and today's information to see if they're equal to each other and then equal to C. This means that we have to loop through each character in the string, but first let's understand how strings are stored in memory. So when yesterday's information is inputted as a string, it is stored something like this. This kind of looks like an array, and in some ways it is very similar. Each character of the string is given its own space or its own box, which has a reference number. This reference number is called the index and can be used to access the value inside the box, kind of like a key. The first character is given the index 0, and so in order to access this character, all we have to do is call on the 0th index that is associated with the character. So in order to access this dot right here, we have to call on the 2nd index, and here 3rd index, and here 4th index. This is true for both of the strings that we created. So meaning yesterday's information and today's information are both stored in the exact same way. So what our program is going to do is going to access the 0th index of both of the strings first and see if the values are equal to each other and then equal to C. If it is not, which it is in this case, it's not equal to C, our program is going to proceed to the next index and do the exact same process. Whenever our program does find an index where the values are equal to each other and equal to C, it will have some way to keep count and will keep counting for every time that occurs. We can start this process by creating a for loop, which will set our I variable, so int I is equal to 0, and this will be our index starter. So we want this loop to be running so long as the index number is less than the length of the actual string, and since both yesterday's info and today's info are the same length, it doesn't really matter which one we pick. So we can just say y_info.length, and we just want to increase our our index by 1 each time that this loop runs to make sure that we get all of the indexes inside the string. Now what happens inside is where we do our comparison. So we want to create a new character variable that stores whatever character is in the ith index. So basically, when I is equal to 0, what we want to do is have this character store whatever character is in the 0th index of the string. And we're going to do that for both yesterday's and today's string. So all we do is we say character, and for the yesterday's information, we can call it character y is equal to whatever the, y_info.character at index I. So when I is equal to 0, it will say, okay, the character at the 0th index in string yesterday's info will give to this variable right here. And we're going to do the exact same thing. So we're just going to copy this, Control C down here, and we're going to say character t is equal to t info at the same index. And that way we'll have the two characters that we want to compare. So once it has done that, we're going to do the comparison using a simple if statement. So we're going to say if y is equal to t, right? So if they're equal to each other, and if y is equal to the character capital C, only then we're going to increase our count. So the reason we're only comparing y to c is because if y is equal to t and y is equal to c, then t is also equal to c. That kind of logic, we just don't need to write it down. It's kind of implied. And only when this condition has been fully met will we increase our count. So we don't have a counter variable, but that's not a problem. We can just create one right here. We can just say int counter is equal to 0. So it'll set at 0, and every time this condition has been met for inside this for loop, we're just going to say increase the count by 1. So we can say counter plus plus, and boom. So now our program should count every single time. Our counter should have the number of parking spaces which have been occupied both yesterday and today. So at the end of our program, outside of the for loop, we're just going to say system.println whatever the counter number is. We can save that, and it should be good to go now. So what we can do, we can test it here. I already have I'm calling the method from, this is like the runner class that I made, and we're going to run it. And all we're going to do is we're going to copy this sample input here, and we should see 1 come out on the end. So we're just gonna go here, click enter, and we see 1 is our result. To test it again, we can go back and try the second sample input, so 7, pasted it, and we get 4. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's a really interesting problem, and I really liked it, and hopefully you guys learned something about strings and just logic concepts in programming in general. Thank you guys so much for listening.